Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is 11th of February, and in today's upload we're looking at an abundance of updates beginning with Verlykovo. We'll then move to Andriivka and Pokrovsk, then we'll move to the highway region northeast of Myrnogorod and Pokrovsk, then of course Chasiv Yar, the bridgehead west of the Oskil River, and we'll finish off with significant attacks coming from both sides in the eastern and western portions of the Kursk front. So let's just zoom in and begin very briefly by looking at this yellow polygon over here, indicating a Russian advance at 4.3 square kilometers northwest of Velika Novosilka, largely in a floodplain near the Mokryali River and in open areas where there are no longer any signs of Ukrainian resistance. The Ukrainian garrison that remains over here, largely from the 110th Brigade and two battalions of the Presidential Brigade, are operating along these trenches that are built in unison in a horizontal line about 2.5 kilometers north of Velika Novosilka in such a way that they are not directly within the purview of the Russian garrison built up in Velika Novosilka, prevents any sort of deep Russian advance that would reach the next layers of defense, including ones that are near Bulatske, Shevchenko, and then further northwards, like 10 kilometers to the north in Komar. But right now, the intensity of fighting over here has decreased significantly over the past 2 weeks. I would say the Russian forces, they've been given an operational rest over here. They've not been engaged in much, if any at all, offensive activity besides a bit of just siphoning off of the remaining open fields, as we saw occur over these past couple of days. You also have just back and forth clashes with Ukrainians trying to counterattack on the northern outskirts of Novi Komar and Rozdolnya, but nothing of any major significance. Where we're seeing the actual significant developments right now would be within Andriivka. There's currently a really difficult battle going on with the Ukrainians trying to hold on to every single house that is possible. But you can see over here that in recent days, I would say specifically over the past 4 days, the Russian forces have been able to chip away at a large chunk of the center of this town. That includes this area that is a bit to the east, that is fallen to Russian hands. And then in the center directly, you could see that Russian forces already do have a very significant presence, including in some of the duplexes, the private residential areas, in the local school, in the town center, with the city council, and all those other structures. Again, as I've said previously, the way in which Andriivka is structured, it makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to drag out fighting for any long period of time. Even though it does have a pretty large surface area, the houses over here are largely just one story, so there isn't a lot of depth in those houses besides perhaps the basements, and they're also not heavily concentrated. There are large amounts of plots of land in between these houses and gardens, and there's also not that much shrubbery that is protecting the houses or the open areas in between them. So it is easier for the Russians to just move from one place to another without the Ukrainians being really afforded any sort of large scale obstacles to hinder the Russian movements. What the Ukrainians were really banking on was this northern line of trenches. They were hoping that this would be able to hold out, but the Russian forces, as we've talked about in previous videos, they were able to exploit a gap in the Ukrainian line, because even though the trenches are present over here, it doesn't really mean much if they're not being manned and are not actively held onto. And that could come in the form of static defenses or counterattacks to retake these locations. But none of that actually came into fruition. So the Russians were able to advance along one concentrated sector and make their presence known with infantry in the center of Andriivka, along, again, a very narrow route that could have been cut off if the Ukrainians did have the wherewithal to then actually counterattack or try to attack the rear, but they just didn't have that ability. So they were always sort of on the back foot, still are. And so now the Russians have been able to widen their salient over here and widen the supply lines, meaning that there is no opportunity for them to be expelled entirely at this point. The Ukrainians are really just trying to drag out the fighting in every single block as long as possible. But based on the percentages of Andriivka already taken, the Russians are already in a prime position to secure the rest of the populated regions, including this area a bit to the north, which is important because it is located on a local hill that includes some of the fortified locations that the Russians are in the process of taking over right now, and then also overlooks the area to the west of Andriivka along this particular highway. It's north of the Vovch River, and it leads to Oleksivka, Bakhatir, and a bunch of other villages that then eventually culminate with the crossing into Dnipro Oblast. So that is, of course, very important from a Russian perspective to capture, as now the Russians are looking forward into the future. The Ukrainians over here, they've redirected the 46th Air Assault Brigade to defend and conduct numerous FPV operations on a daily basis, because the Ukrainians, their infantry is trying to avoid direct combat with the Russian side. They're also trying to avoid direct encirclements by the Russians, but their FPV crews are extremely active around here, including the 3rd Battalion. They released this video which indicated a Russian presence in the center on February 10th. That's how we know about this, and they're being aided by numerous other UAV units like the Raid Battalion, and the list just goes on. And in their stead, the 46th Brigade has been replaced by the 33rd Brigade in the Dachne region, where nonetheless, even though the Russians have been able to advance both along the northern and southern flanks and create this very, very deep pincer maneuver for the remaining Ukrainians in the populated areas, due to the way in which it's structured with all of this dense housing and the Ukrainians really succeeding in holding onto the basements. They've not been able to push them out just yet. And the Ukrainians are also hoping to, once they eventually lose Dachne, try to drag out the fighting for as long as possible in the trenches that were built over the 2015 period in this area over here with the Dragon's Teeth, or near some of the other trench complexes that you can see on the map, or that are located in tree lines that aren't really demarcated on my map. So all of that is currently unfolding, and is really important because it will decide the fates of the remaining, say, 23 square kilometers of territory south of the current Russian push into Andriivka, in areas like Konstantinopil and Ulakli, where you have just an insane amount of Ukrainian units dispersed trying to hold back the Russian offensive activity. Now, in the Srebny region, you could see the Russians capturing almost zero point 0.6 square kilometers, including nearly all of the village of Srebny, besides this northern chunk over here. And they've also been able to infiltrate into Zaporizhzhia along the main road that pushes into it. There's a video here from February 8th. It was recorded by the 59th Tank Brigade, but apparently it was actually a tank battalion from the 225th Assault Brigade, or not brigade, but regiment. It used to be a battalion, but it was upgraded to a regiment, if I recall correctly. And so it appears they may be split between the Kursk region and the fighting in the Dnipro direction, because I know for a fact that they used to fight in the area that is closer to the Kuranovo section of Kursk. And they were really one of Ukraine's main units that they leaned upon to conduct counterattacking actions and even a lot of the most important defensive activities. So it is possible they've now been redirected, at least partially, to this location in order to make use of their Western provided tanks. And so they could be working in tandem with the tank battalion of the 59th Brigade, which is also very important and has played a big role, not just in Srebny, but also to the north in an area like Kupyansk or Dachne, basically across this entire line that I would say spans like 15 kilometers, that is trying to protect the Ukrainians and the border that they have to the west with Dnipro Oblast. But regardless of that, the Russian forces have been able to continue with their advance and are now clashing in this village Zaporizhzhia, which is the final one before you reach this village here, Preobrazhenka. And then you just reach an area that is on relatively high elevation and is also in an open region that provides a large amount of leeway to push eastwards and get very, very close to that state border. But to the north, you could see there's slight Russian advance south of Andriivka, nothing of much importance. Russians have recently called off some of their offensive activities in Uspanivka due to the Ukrainian defensive wherewithal being very strong around here. Even though Uspanivka is a small village, the Ukrainian infantry has been able to dig in within those basements and prevent Russian frontal attacks. They've mainly been using private vehicles and motorcycles in their armored assaults towards this region, because moving in any sort of larger vehicles over here in the past, it has led to pretty large losses in this direction. And when they are utilized, it is really risky in such a heated area of the front line, where the Ukrainians do have a lot of drone crews concentrated that are prepared for such a scenario. And so, really, it is just a matter of attrition between the Russian troops on the ground and the Ukrainian troops on the ground. And right now, the Ukrainians from several battalions of the 59th Brigade, like the 9th, have been able to prove that they're capable of holding out in this location, which has put a wrench in Russia's plans to advance continually westwards along the Solana River towards the state border. And so for now, that's not actually coming into fruition. And actually, some of the offensive activities have been called off by the Russians, and now they're just trying to stay back in and attrit the Ukrainians entirely by just using FPV strikes and artillery strikes on the Ukrainian positions over here. Also, a bit to the north, there was a slight Russian advance deeper into Odradne, based on a video from February 10th of the Ukrainian shelling of eastern Odradne. But again, for the most part, the Ukrainian troops in this region that probably are consisting of the 42nd Brigade and maybe parts of Skala Regiment and 32nd Brigade, they've been able to hold out effectively and prevent any deeper Russian penetrations. An area where you do have a lot of back and forth fighting, and actually think that my map could be inaccurate, is Kotlina, because a lot of Ukrainian sources would claim that the front line that I'm showing over here is pretty favorable to Russia, and that the real situation would actually be reflective of something that looks more like this, where I'm marking the line of contact in red for you guys, wherein the route that the Russians have to actually supply Kotlina is extremely narrow. It basically rests upon the rail line and the T046 highway, and that any fields either to the east or to the west are currently in a gray zone where it's simply untenable for large movements, especially on vehicle, to move forces or equipment in and out of Kotlina, because the Ukrainians, they are still exerting a significant amount of pressure on those flanks, including on the western flank of Kotlina, but more significantly to the east, where we do have geolocated proof to indicate that the Ukrainians are at the very least located in some of those outer environs. You could see that some of that is indicated from earlier footage from the later stages of January, but Ukrainian sources do still claim that they retain a presence over here, and they've actually been able to advance even deeper, and that it's largely being carried out by the Skala Assault Regiment. The Skala Regiment is one of the key components of Ukraine's current strategy in this location, because as I was saying a couple of weeks ago, once the Russians reach this line that I'm going to mark just very generally in red for you guys, the Ukrainians had a decision to make. They could have held out for maybe another month with just purely defensive operations, and then would have to really acknowledge and cede a large chunk of territory that would be extremely consequential for the future of Pokrovsk. What I mean by that is that eventually, due to the continued Russian momentum, which was not showing any signs of stopping, even if the amount of vehicles being utilized in each attack was decreasing, Russian infantry was still being given the orders and still had the potential to conduct numerous attacks just on foot, to push from one village to another on a daily basis in such a way that definitely overwhelmed the Ukrainians. And so eventually it was going to reach some sort of boiling point where the Ukrainians would no longer be in control of any populated areas along this red line, and then they would have nowhere to really dig their heels in this open field region that is located to the north, which is located in a high elevation, and also would then connect to the E50 highway that pushes into Pokrovsk. So if in a certain scenario that could happen still in the very near future, depending on the way things play out, the Russians were able to take over all of the populated regions along this bottom red line. At some point, the Ukrainians would have to then cede the area to the north, those open fields, because they would just be untenable for them to maintain control over there. The Russians would concentrate a large amount of firepower on Ukrainian troops out in the open, and they would just have no way to organize an effective line of defense there without any sort of static defenses previously prepared. And so then you could see a retreat towards the state border, Serhivka, and some of the geographic ditches, and then it would sort of just culminate around the center of Pokrovsk. And that was a very probable scenario a couple of weeks ago when the Russians showed no signs of being stopped in their offensive activities. But as I said before, the Ukrainians could have either let the situation sort of be dragged out and eventually reach that sort of worst case scenario, or they could have been more proactive and conducted localized counterattacks in order to keep their presence over here and prevent a really difficult situation from unfolding for the western flank of the city that they're trying to defend in the first place. And so that's what happened over here. I was worrying about it because really the Ukrainians had no other choice. It was either they counterattacked at that point or they would never have an opportunity to hold on to the western flank at any other advantageous position. So that's why the Ukrainians did move in some reinforcements, including from Brigade 42, from Skala Assault Regiment, from numerous other units. And we'll get to one of them in a second, and they were able to concentrate those counterattacks in certain areas like Dachne, where they were able to stabilize the situation, and it has remained that way for now like a week and a half. also in Kotline. Even though the Russians do control almost all the populated areas, they're not able to effectively expand past it at this point due to the really significant resistance coming from Pokrovsk itself, where you do have these Bradley crews that are dismounting on a daily basis and conducting these assaults just to the east of the town. And then you also have Pishchane, where you have the Russians being pushed out almost entirely due to movements of the Ukrainians over the past week, largely from Brigade 68th, the Jaeger Brigade that I'm talking about. They previously were operating in an area to the east, probably like Chasiv Yar, Sivka, the Chenska, etc. But that region right now is not the most critical part of the front line. The Ukrainians have been able to achieve some sort of order over there, and the Russians haven't shown many signs of trying to ramp up offensive activity. And so it's understandable why a unit that is already accustomed to this part of the front line would be moved a couple of kilometers westwards to engage in an area where they're desperately needed because of their experience with this sort of high intensity fighting. So now they've been moved to the Pishchane region and are spearheading the counterattack over here. So far, they've been able to capture 0.75 square kilometers of territory, but it's more so about the quality of the territory that they're taking, not just about the square kilometers captured. And you can see that with the footage over here. Vandal FPV strike by the Sudoplatov elements that struck the mine number 3 in Pishchane under the control of the Ukrainians right now. You also have a couple of other videos of Ukrainian vehicles that were targeted by the Sudoplatov elements and their fiber optic drones as they were pushing deeper and deeper into the residential areas of Pishchane. And here you have a video of a Max Pro, Ukrainian Max Pro, getting hit and then subsequently destroyed as the 68th Jaeger Brigade was dismounting 8 troops in the western parts of the town. And so even though the Russians do still retain control of important positions to the east or to the west of the populated area, due to the concentrated Ukrainian counterattack, they have lost their positions in the town itself, which was the task of the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade. They were supposed to take it in the first place, and now they've just been pushed back slightly. But this unit has been involved in numerous Russian victories, so this is not really some sort of condemnation of their offensive capacity. They definitely retain it, and maybe they need now a bit of a rotation because they've been involved in such high intensity and really high pace attacks for numerous months now. So it is understandable that eventually they would be caught out and pushed out of at least one of the locations they took over. But for instance, like Zelene and Shevchenko and Novotroitska, they were involved in that and were able to take those areas in pretty quick fashion, actually. But now the Ukrainians have been able to find an area where they can create a wedge and really, as a result, reduce the Russian momentum and really stall any future plans for offensives. But over here, you can see the Russians did actually advance north of Pishchane in an open field region, capturing 1.1 square kilometers of territory. This is on February 9th. The Nova unit, their drones dropped grenades onto Russian troops located within these trenches over here. And this is an important area to keep an eye out for because it could be an attempt by the Russians to try to cut off the Ukrainian salient that is currently involved with holding onto the eastern part of Kotline. So again, really an important area to watch because it's really going to help decide how long the Ukrainians could end up holding out in Pokrovsk itself before it actually reaches the point of being an urban battle. And I know over here as well, the Ukrainians being proactive, they deployed recently the 25th Air Mobile Brigade to this location to replace some other units that were rotated out to fight in other parts of the front line, for instance, a bit to the west where they were more needed. And so the 25th Brigade was given a lower intensity part of the front line. But of course, we're speaking in relative terms. And now, after a couple of months of being more so on the back burner, they're involved in this counterattack, capturing 1.3 square kilometers of territory, crossing the current trench line that is running basically into Lasivka and then re-entering into the Chenska, at least into the eastern portions of it, and in total advancing 1.4 kilometers southwards. Not a significant advance by any means, but it is a way to just stall the Russian attacks over here and gain a foothold within the new line of Russian villages that is being used to project power and move logistics up closer and closer to the front line towards the city of Pokrovsk itself. So that is all important to keep an eye out for. Over here to the northeast, this is also important. In recent days, Deep State has acknowledged that the Russian forces have cut off the highway leading into Mirhad. You can see over here the Russians captured at least 1.3 square kilometers of territory, and that includes this warehouse region. It includes the local roads that are leading up to it and some of the tree lines. And then also to the west of Baranivka, the Russians captured another plot of land. But Deep State is adamant that the Ukrainians conducted a successful counterattack in Volyane, although there was never any confirmation and never any suggestion, at least that I saw, that the Russians were even in it in the first place. So I don't think that there was really any counterattack. It's just that the Ukrainians are reaffirming their positions here. Although it's becoming more difficult due to the Russians sort of establishing these western and eastern pincers that are threatening the village on its flanks, and it is a pretty small village in terms of the amount of houses or the surface area. So it could be an area of concern in the future if the Russians are looking to further expand their control along the highway. But I think they first need to retain control over it because it's not their first time stepping foot on it before being pushed back. So now it's going to be a matter of just consolidation for the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade that is involved in these attacks. A bit to the north in Chasiv Yar, just briefly, Russian forces captured this region east of Supochki, amounting to 1.2 square kilometers of territory, also north of this quarry over here. And this includes a lot of forested regions. So just the Russians continuing to chip away at those locations that are farther away from the urban center, but are closer to some rural regions like Stupochki. And again, Stupochki is important because it is the access routes to the T0504 highway that then eventually reaches into Kostantinivka. So that's something for the future. And then in Chasiv Yar itself, the Russians captured this plot of land that is south of some of the local ponds and forested regions. It's also pretty close to the actual heartland of Chasiv Yar in the center. But right now, a lot of the battles are engulfed in this sort of southeastern corner. You can see my screen, my mouse, sorry, hovering over this corner because this is where we're seeing some of the most violent confrontations, including armored assaults and then back and forth firefights. So over here on February 10th, a Ukrainian BMP was destroyed by a mine and by an FPV strike of Russia's 215th Reconnaissance Battalion, a part of their 98th VDV division. So they're also operating around here. And you also have a lot of Ukrainian vehicles coming in to resupply that are getting targeted on the way in, especially in this forested region where before they reach any sort of specific route that is demarcated for them, they are very exposed to drones from the Russian side. Now, with the fiber optics being implemented widely across the front line, we saw them first in Kursk and then in Verlykovo and Pokrovsk, and now we're going to see them really increase in presence all across the front line, including in Chasiv Yar. Over here in the Kursk bridgehead region, the Russians have been able to expand control even further westwards, another 1 square kilometer of territory west of Zaporizhzhia. We're getting very close to cutting off the P79 highway and another location, which then would lead southwards to the northern outskirts of western Kupyansk. That is extremely important for the future logistics of the Ukrainian defense node. Then over here, the Russians solidified control over large chunks of open space, forested regions, and also the R79 highway. This amounts to 2.5 square kilometers of territory in between the two large bridgeheads that were established by the Russians. Now they are more connected on the other side of the river. So, for instance, you have the Zaporizhzhia section over here. Here you have the Conduit region, and then here you have the Zaporizhzhia bridgehead, which is really important because it includes the largest settlement that the Russians have under their control that is located west of the river and is used as an organization point. At this point, the Ukrainian sources that are fighting in this location do acknowledge that the Russians do have pretty solid logistics and that it's more than just a mere bridgehead. It's becoming an entire system, an entire part of the front line that is sizable, that is now going to begin seeing armored vehicles. I don't think I've seen any of it yet, but it's definitely reaching that point. We have to keep an eye out for pontoons because the logistics are beginning to get beefed up and mortars are getting moved closer and closer to the front line, closer towards the Ukrainian rear positions where they're staging up with infantry positions and armored vehicles. But again, I've warned about this numerous times. There needs to be more involvement of additional Ukrainian units. I would say it could be from the Luhansk front, really anywhere from the Luhansk front, or it could even be from the Vovchansk or Lipsy axes, but there has to be at least two more brigades moved in order to quell this and stop this Russian advance in its infancy. And it really should be stopped in infancy because there is a lot of a potential to exploit on the rear in some of these locations, especially to the northwest of the current bridgehead, where you just see a lack of Ukrainian defenses for about 14 kilometers. And this is an area that is extremely dangerous. So I would just really warn for everybody from all sides about that sort of potential moving forward. Over here in the Kursk region, I want to begin by looking at the Ukrainian counterattacks. They've been able to slightly advance. You can see over here another 26 hectares of territory taken, and we have a bit of a geolocation from this region. A lot of the videos came out from the initial batch of Ukrainian columns on February 6th, and then there were a couple of other videos or satellite imagery from the coming days up until February 9th, indicating that there were Ukrainian attacks. Over here, it's just Russians shelling 6 armored vehicles as they were approaching a local forest patch, which is the really body of territory separating the Ukrainians from Ulyanok. But despite their best efforts, the Ukrainians have been unable to enter Ulyanok. Right now, they're at least 2 kilometers away from it. And so there's still a long way to go if the Ukrainians are interested in reaching that point. But for now, they do still retain control over the salient they've been able to establish, this very deep bulge. They've also been able to widen it in certain locations, for instance, capturing over here 1.5 square kilometers in most of Cherkasskaya Konopelka. And also, we haven't seen them really take advantage of this flanking maneuver in order to fully push the Russians out of the region north of the Psel River, because you could understand why the Ukrainians would want to try to push the Russians out of these locations here, because it does provide a forward outpost for troops to move through an area that is pretty concealed because of the forestry towards the southern outskirts of Suja. But so far, they've been unable to push the Russians out entirely of these locations, which I believe is a really big part of why the Ukrainians launched the offensive activities in the first place. So for now, that hasn't really come into fruition. There's a couple of other videos from this location. For instance, here, the 82nd Brigade destroyed 2 Russian BMPs that were conducting a localized counterattack. Here you can see, this is not relevant. There's a video over here of Russian helicopters and also drones dropping grenades targeting Ukrainian vehicles and infantry west of Ruska Konopelka, because this was also another Ukrainian attempt at conducting an offensive activity. They were trying to just get their foot in the door within this village on day one of the operation, but they were unable to do so. I think they did not pour in many resources over here. It was really a secondary option or secondary concern for the Ukrainian side. And I actually think it should have been a larger concern for them, because taking control of Ruska Konopelka would then give them the momentum to push towards Pushkarnoy. And that would therefore eliminate one of the most important lines of villages and ditches that the Russians currently employ in order to project power to the east of Suja. So it could have been another option, but the Ukrainians decided that it was more critical for them to focus southwards on the looming Russian threat that was approaching towards Bakhnovka. So I can understand it, but even in that case, they've been unable to fundamentally change the dynamics of this front line. All they've been able to do at this point is just gain an additional chunk of territory, which will force the Russians to either just stabilize the situation and call it a day at this point, or engage in a grinding offensive and attritional offensive over the course of an extended period of time to retake these locations. And that would, of course, buy time for the Ukrainians a couple of kilometers to the northwest that are defending in Suja, and then the rest of the 500 square kilometers under Ukrainian control in the Kursk region. Also, I've been making some adjustments to the front line because the Ukrainians have been able to, and it's not happened in one fell swoop, it happened over the course of a couple of weeks. They've been able to improve their tactical position in a lot of these regions. So it amounts to basically an advance of 3 square kilometers for the Ukrainian side, but have also added in some additional territory for Russian control, largely in open fields and in forested patches that are close to the line of villages that you currently see under Ukrainian control. This entire spine of villages has been able to resist an onslaught of Russian VDV assaults. It's mainly been from the VDV. The VDV recently decreased the amount of MTLBs, BMPs, armored vehicles utilized. They still do utilize a large amount of tanks, because really tanks are a big part of the way in which they provide fire support during the actual assaults. And then there's also been an increase in motorcycles and in private civilian vehicles being utilized, but also a lot of utilization of infantry-based assaults that are almost entirely just done not even with that, not even with the support of private civilian vehicles, and that's done usually through small squads operating in those forested patches, pushing directly eastwards towards the spine of villages. But so far, that's been unsuccessful, and the Ukrainians have been able to very slightly broaden control to the west of some of these villages, like Viktorovka, Nikolaevka, and Staraya Storichna. But this has also come at a time where the Russians have generally decreased their pace of offensive activity in this region after it was extremely heightened in the beginning of January. To zoom in, the Russians over here have been able to succeed in gaining control over a large chunk of territory, and I'm actually sort of minimizing it. And in the next video, I'm going to fully clarify the situation over here. But the Russians have been able to infiltrate even deeper into Verlykovo, which is very important for the future of the Kursk region. You can see over here the Russians have been able to take 8 square kilometers of territory, including Nizhny Klin, and this is based on a video from February 9th of the Alcor FPV unit of the 116th Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto individual Russian soldiers and several Russian vehicles on this horizontal road that connects between the road to Sverdlikovo over here and to the Reno. So also the Ukrainians are claiming that North Korean infantry are involved in these operations and that they're working in tandem with the Russians to actually conduct motorized assaults. Again, not proof of that yet, so I'm just going to wait and see if there is actually North Korean involvement over here, because recently Ukrainian sources, local unit sources, have been talking about redeployment of North Korean soldiers to this Verlykovo region, and this is now the area where apparently they are the most abundant and are now being given orders to conduct these offensive activities to capture the village. Again, we're going to have to wait and see if that's true, but regardless of that fact, there definitely is Russian troops. There are Russian troops located within the northern parts of this town. So there are geolocations. For instance, this one over here from February 9th, 36th Marine Brigade, they dropped grenades onto Russian infantry in northern Sverdlikovo, and they were also able to destroy 2 MRAPs and 1 VPK Ural, which is a Russian military vehicle, and it had a mine plower. So that was also targeted because in this area, despite other Russian attacks not really being reliant on vehicles, in this case, there is just a perfect route for armored vehicles to come in from Zeleny Shlaich, and it leads directly to Sverdlikovo. So it was just understandable for the Russians to operate in such a manner. And as a result, the Russians are now in control of a large chunk of this village, and it is pretty small in surface area. So gaining foothold is absolutely critical. And what it would mean is that the Russians would be able to retake one of the first villages they lost during the entire Kursk offensive, one where they actually lost a lot of POWs, the Russian side. And it also acts as a sort of conduit between the Sumy region, where currently Ukrainian logistics are extremely hampered due to the fiber optic FPVs targeting numerous convoys of armored vehicles and supplies that are coming in to the Kursk region. And now it will become even more difficult because it will be used as a forward staging point to target the Sumy rear. And remember, southern Kursk does not contain a lot of really large encompassing road networks. So Sverdlikovo is one of the regions that is one of those main roads actually does run through. So having physical access to it is very important, because then it could be used as one of the very few routes to actually reach Suja. And right now, based on the Russian location, they are about 9 kilometers away by road from reaching right now the northwestern outskirts of Suja. So it is very important. And if the Russians get control over it, there are no other settlements in between. Of course, there's still a large way to go in terms of just troop density and maybe fortifications or just open fields that have to be traversed, but no actual settlements in between. So it's absolutely critical for the Ukrainians to retain control in Sverdlikovo, not just for Sumy, but also for their control in Kursk. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.